Hello. If I may, I'd like to begin by reminding anyone who may be interested in the essays on this channel that I've recently started a channel in which I read my short stories. There are 3 I've posted so far, but it will grow. I'll post a link for the channel below for anyone who may be interested in it. In 1857, while Britain was thrilled and shocked in equal measure by the lurid details of the trial of Madeline Smith for the murder of her lover Émile Langelier, across the pond another trial was creating ripples. That's the trial of Emma Cunningham for the murder of Dr. Harvey Burdell in New York City. It was every bit as scandalous as that of Madeline Smith in its own way. Emma Cunningham was an extraordinary woman, and there's little doubt she got away with murder. January 1857 was the coldest January New York City had ever known. Temperatures plummeted to -50°F across the whole eastern seaboard. In the 3rd week in January, at White River Junction, 250 miles away, the mercury in thermometers froze. At about 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, the 30th of January, John Burchell, an errand boy at number 31 Bond Street, New York City, collected coals to supply the fires in the house and deposited a scuttle outside his master's room. He noticed his master, Dr. Harvey Burdell, had left the key in the outside keyhole of the door, which was unusual, as the doctor was in the habit of locking his door when in his room and also when he went out. A little later on, the errand boy returned to the room and, upon opening the door, discovered blood on the wall and on the cupboard door. He entered the room, and here he found Dr. Burdell lying face down on the floor in a pool of congealed blood. He ran to the cook, Hannah Conlon, and told her of this, and the two went upstairs to the 3rd floor, where a Mrs. Emma Cunningham had lodging rooms. Another dweller of the house, 18-year-old George Snodgrass, sent the errand boy to fetch a doctor. The doctor arrived soon afterwards, and pronounced that Dr. Burdell was dead. Judging by the extent of rigor mortis in the body, and the body temperature and the congealment of blood about it, it was clear that the death had occurred during the previous evening. Dr. Harvey Burdell, a surgeon-dentist, was 45 years old at the time of his death, having been born in 1811 in Jefferson, New York, one of 5 brothers. He graduated from Pennsylvania Medical College in his early 20s, returning to New York City, where he began practicing at the corner of Chambers Street and Broadway. He was a heavily built man, said to be mean, quick-tempered, and a womanizer. He had a reputation for quarrelling with almost everyone he had dealings with, was a persistent litigant, defaulter on debts, and largely estranged from his relatives. He was well off financially, though, worth $100,000. That's about $3.5 million in 2023 terms, although most of his money was in property and stock. He had purchased number 31 Bond Street 4 years earlier, in May 1853, a large, expensive 4-story property where he retained only one room on the 2nd floor for his own use, practicing as a dentist and/or doctor as circumstances required, and using the room as a surgery. It served as his living quarters too. He slept on the sofa and took his meals in cheap restaurants in the neighborhood, apparently with the objective of saving money. The rest of the rooms in the 4-story house he let out to Mrs. Emma Cunningham, who sublet rooms to others, which gave him an additional source of income. On the morning of the tragedy, various doctors, the New York City coroner, and officers of the New York Municipal Police attended the scene. They found a great deal of blood spatter on a cupboard door and a wall near the entrance door, which plainly indicated that Dr. Burdell had been attacked and killed in the room. There was also blood in the hallway leading down to the front door and on the inside doorknob, suggesting the killer had gone this way after the murder, but no blood on the outer doorknob could be discovered. There were no indications that a robbery had occurred either, nor that the house had been broken into, and inquiries regarding Dr. Burdell, although revealing he was neither a well-liked nor a popular man, nevertheless did not uncover anyone who was sufficiently aggrieved with him or of a temperament to murder him. It therefore seemed to police that someone within the house was responsible for the doctor's death. The other occupants of the house were questioned concerning their movements on the night of Friday, January the 29th. There were 9 residents of the house in Bond Street, apart from Dr. Burdell. These were Mrs. Emma Cunningham, an attractive widow in a severe sort of way, of 38 years, who had 2 daughters, Helen and Augusta, living with her at the time, and 2 younger sons. Also a man called John Eckel, a dealer in tallow and hides, who was said to be sexually involved with Mrs. Cunningham. An 18-year-old boy, George Snodgrass, son of a church minister, a lawyer called Daniel Ullman, and Hannah Conlon, the cook. The police were told that at about 10 o'clock the previous evening, Mrs. Cunningham sent her servant and children to bed, and sometime between 10 and 11 retired herself, as did the others, with the exception of Daniel Ullman, who, by common consent, was absent from the house, not returning until about 12:30 a.m. He appeared to have been rarely at the house, and could give little intelligence in the matter of the events of the evening of the 29th of January, nor of the occupants of the house and their relations. The cook, Snodgrass, and the 2 little boys slept in the attic rooms on the 4th floor. Mrs. Cunningham and her daughters occupied a room on the 3rd floor, John Eckel another room on the same floor, and Daniel Ullman in a 3rd room, also on the 3rd floor. As Dr. Burdell had been murdered in his own room on the 2nd floor, judging from the blood spatter there, it seemed odd that none of those in the house, especially those immediately above on the 3rd floor, had heard anything of a violent altercation. But according to their accounts, none of them had been disturbed during the night by any unusual noise or cry. However, 4 witnesses were discovered who appeared to have seen or heard something of the murder. The first of these, William Ross, said that at about 11:15 he had been walking along Bond Street when he saw a tall, well-built man with a shawl about his shoulders entering number 31. The man had opened the door with his key and went inside. When I got about a house and a half or 2 houses on, I heard the cry of "Murd!" Short like that. The word wasn't finished, said Ross. The second witness, Mr. Strangman, also at about this time, was in Bond Street near number 31, but on the opposite side of the road. He said, "I heard a sharp, stifled cry. The cry was loud and like that of a person in agony. It was a sort of a shrill cry. I looked up and down Bond Street at the time and saw no persons in the street." A third witness, Charles Brooks, living at 36 Bond Street, diagonally opposite to number 31, also heard a disturbance between 10:30 and 10:45. The first syllable, "mer," was distinct, he said, but the "der" was prolonged and guttural. I was going to bed. Through the Venetian blinds I could distinctly see the house, number 31. The night being very still, I thought I heard a noise as of shuffling on a floor. I looked up the street in order to see if garrotters were around. I saw nothing further. A fourth man named William Farrell was in Bond Street between 10 and 11 o'clock, and coming to number 31, he sat down on the doorstep to lace up his shoe. While he was doing this, 2 men approached him, one of whom came onto the step, while the other passed on. In a half-minute or so after the man went into the house, I heard a cry of "Murder!" I said to myself, There's a muss in this house." "In probably a minute," Farrell said, "I heard the retreating step of the man who had gone in. When the noise was over, I heard a door open. After the cry, I heard a noise of a shaking, as if something solid, like a barrel, had been turned down. In half a minute, a man came to the door and opened it. I looked up, and he said, 'What are you doing there?' The man was in his shirt sleeves. I thought he had been sent by the man who first went in to turn me off the step, and I took my shoe in my hand to 3 or 4 doors off. The man who went into the house had a shawl on. The sound I heard was like that of someone choking." These statements, in spite of apparent discrepancies, appeared to fix the time at which Dr. Burdell had arrived home and of the murder as being sometime around 10:45 p.m. A post-mortem revealed that Dr. Burdell had been strangled and stabbed 15 times about the neck and chest, one wound having penetrated the heart. But any one of a number of these was judged to be sufficient to have caused Harvey Burdell's death. The weapon used was ascertained to be a long knife with a blade approximately 8 inches long and 3/4 of an inch wide. A curious factor was that this appeared to have been wielded by a left-handed person. As the only left-handed person in the house was Mrs. Emma Cunningham, and she was said to have had difficult relations with Harvey Burdell, suspicions quickly settled on her. Emma Cunningham was born Emma Augusta Hempstead on the 15th of August 1818 in New York to Christopher Hempstead, a rope maker, and his wife Sarah. In 1835, at the age of 17, she married 35-year-old George Cunningham, a prosperous distiller. During the next few years, they had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. George Cunningham died in 1854, leaving Emma a widow. It was provident, therefore, that George had previously taken out a large insurance policy for $10,000. That's approximately $350,000 in 2023, because it left her in a financially secure position. George had been well off, but suffered a reversal of his fortunes as a result of speculation, and his finances were in difficulties at the time of his death. He was found dead in his bed one morning, and this caused widespread suspicion amongst acquaintances, neighbours, and the police that Emma Cunningham was responsible for this. But there was nothing in the way of proof in this, and soon afterwards Emma moved to New York with her children, and then to 31 Bond Street. It seems that she and Burdell were involved in a relationship during this time, that he probably indicated he would marry her, but they subsequently fell out. After this time, she was involved with a man called John Eckel, who also resided on the 3rd floor of the house as a tenant. An inquest was opened on the 31st of January under the New York City coroner, Dr. Edward Downs Connery, at the house at 31 Bond Street, at which a great many witnesses were called. It lasted for 14 days and was a thorough, perhaps too thorough, affair, which answered more questions than were asked, and left unanswered many which should have been asked but were not. The jury were given a surprising degree of license to question the witnesses and intrude upon the proceedings. At one point they demanded that the eyes of Dr. Burdell's corpse be examined, because they believed the image of the last thing seen before death would be imprinted on the retinas of his eyes, rather like the recently invented daguerreotype camera, and would therefore reveal the image of his killer. Professor Robert Doremus was prevailed upon to examine these through the lens of a powerful microscope. To the jurors' disappointment, however, the image of the killer was not printed on Dr. Burdell's retinas. The most startling event, though, occurred on the first day of the inquest, when Mrs. Emma Cunningham, who leased the house from the doctor, produced a marriage certificate which stated that she and the victim, Dr. Burdell, had been married 3 months earlier, on the 28th of October, 1856. She said the marriage had been kept secret at the doctor's insistence. According to the marriage certificate, the ceremony had been conducted by Reverend Uriah Marvin of the Reformed Dutch Church, and apart from herself and Dr. Burdell, her eldest daughter Augusta and Reverend Marvin's maidservant had been present, acting as the 2 witnesses. This resulted in a flurry of investigative activities and the calling of the Reverend Marvin and his maidservant to the inquest to give evidence. Although both clearly recalled the wedding, and Emma Cunningham and her daughter Augusta, neither recognized Dr. Harvey Burdell as being the groom on that occasion. In fact, Reverend Marvin said that on the occasion of the ceremony itself, and on the following day, when the man who had represented himself as Dr. Burdell came to collect the marriage certificate, he had noticed his whiskers and thought they were false. He had remarked as much to his wife. It was also curious, thought Reverend Marvin, that the man calling himself Dr. Burdell had failed to notice his name had been misspelled in the register, something he, Reverend Marvin, had subsequently rectified himself. When the Reverend and maidservant saw John Eckel, they identified him as being the man who had called himself Dr. Burdell, but thought he had more hair on that occasion. Other witnesses called at the inquest, a maidservant, Mary Donahue, who lived at the house but had left by the time of the murder, attested that although Burdell had often taken his meals in the rooms of Mrs. Cunningham previously, he had ceased doing so from the autumn of 1856. This was at the time the two had fallen out, and also the time of the alleged marriage. Furthermore, from this time on he had refused food and drink she sent him. She also said that after the autumn of 1856 there were no instances of which she was aware in which Dr. Burdell and Emma Cunningham had cohabited, stayed, or slept in the same room. There was no indication of any intimacy between them from this time at all, still less of their being married. She did assert, however, that Mrs. Cunningham and John Eckel were involved in an intimate relationship. John Eckel had an adjoining room to Emma Cunningham, and she said his bed usually gave the appearance of not having been slept in, although that of Mrs. Cunningham seemed to have been slept in by more than one person. The circumstances of the night of the murder, the conditions of those who lived at number 31 and their relations, their backgrounds and histories were gone into in great detail at the inquest. Police inquiries continued abreast and supplied a great deal of supplementary evidence, extensively reported by the press, all adding grist to the busy mill of the public imagination, which had become enthralled by the lurid events at number 31. The newspapers spoke with one voice on the matter, and there was little restraint exercised by them in identifying Mrs. Cunningham and John Eckel as having committed the murder. There was, no doubt, considerable evidence in support of this. First, there was the dire state of relations between Harvey Burdell and Emma Cunningham. At the time of his death, Dr. Burdell was clearly a wealthy man. He had told several people that he was a confirmed bachelor and had no intentions of marrying. He indicated to these people that Mrs. Cunningham was doing her level best to trap him into marriage. He said he feared her and that she was capable of anything. He asked his friend and former partner, a Dr. Blaisdell, to move into the house because of his fear that Mrs. Cunningham and John Eckel would murder him. He told Blaisdell he had made a will in favor of his relatives and that he had no intention of leaving Mrs. Cunningham anything, although she appears to have been threatening him in some way to do so. However, the will could not be found amongst the doctor's possessions. At a party at number 31 Bond Street on the 14th of January, 2 weeks before the murder, Dr. Burdell and Mrs. Cunningham had again been at odds. The party had cost Mrs. Cunningham $200, and when the caterer called to present his bill, she said she couldn't pay him, but would pay him in early February because she would have plenty of money by then. Mrs. Cunningham was also reported to have said it was time he, Dr. Burdell, was out of this world, that he is a bad man. And things got worse. Dr. Burdell called a police officer on the 24th of January, 5 days before his murder, seeking the arrest of Mrs. Cunningham. He had accused her of the theft of a judgment against his brother worth $600 from his safe, and he pushed her daughter, Augusta, from the room, roughly. He claimed to the servant that she had pulled some of his hair out. That night, Mrs. Cunningham sent the servants to bed at 9 p.m. A highly unusual action, which drew protests from them. Mr. Eccles and George Snodgrass were with her in the parlour at the time. The following day, the cook and Mary Donohoe were ordered to bed early again. That was January the 25th, just 4 days before the murder of Harvey Burdell. George Snodgrass was often with Emma Cunningham and John Eccles, and he had called Burdell a devil, according to Mary Donohoe, who ought to get his head knocked in. On this occasion, John Eccles responded, "It wouldn't be a little matter if he did get a knock, if it could be done handy." Mary said she didn't like the way he looked at Mrs. Cunningham when he said this. A woman who had known Dr. Burdell for 12 years said he had called Mrs. Cunningham the most horrible woman I have ever met, and thank heavens I will get rid of them all on the 1st of May. In this he was referring to a document he had drawn up relating to Mrs. Cunningham leaving the house at the end of her 12-month lease. Apparently Dr. Burdell was due to sign this the day after the day his death was discovered. His death, therefore, prevented him from doing so. On the night of the murder, Emma Cunningham said she slept with her 2 daughters, something which was not a common occurrence. It was suspected that this was a story invented with the purpose of providing her with an alibi. Apart from the veiled threat he had made in the maid's presence and his seeming to have impersonated Dr. Burdell at the purported marriage ceremony between them in October, Mr. and Mrs. Cyrena Stevens identified John Eccles as being a man who had visited them posing as a lawyer, calling himself Van Dolen, to discuss Dr. Burdell and Cunningham. Except, they said, that Van Dolen had more hair than Eccles. Stevens had taken Van Dolen's address on that occasion and subsequently visited him, only to discover that the man Van Dolen did not exist. A dark wig was subsequently discovered amongst John Eccles' possessions, which seemed also to account for Reverend Marvin's statement that the man posing as Dr. Burdell at the wedding ceremony looked like Eccles, but had more hair. The inquest also heard that Eccles had left the house on the morning of the 30th of January unusually early, before the discovery of the body. He claimed he had done so because he had to meet a man on business, but the man concerned said the matter was not urgent at all. Mary Donohoe said Eccles never left the house before breakfast. The morning of the murder seemed, therefore, an exception. The errand boy, John Burchell, said Mrs. Cunningham had downcast eyes on the morning of the murder, seemed preoccupied, did not greet him in her usual fashion. Furthermore, in the storeroom in the attic, a towel, a sheet, and a man's shirt were discovered with blood on them. The shirt was identified as belonging to George Snodgrass, the towel to Dr. Blundell, and it was believed that the killer or killers had used these to clean up. And neighbours at number 32 Bond Street said there had been the distinctive smell of burning cloth in the street near the house in the early hours of the 30th of January. The knife was never discovered, although a dagger and a revolver belonging to Dr. Burdell were found in Mrs. Cunningham's room. The dagger was discounted as being the murder weapon, and the revolver was obviously not the assassin's weapon. From all of this, and the evidence that the knife wounds had been inflicted on Dr. Burdell by a left-handed person, and Emma Cunningham was the only left-handed person in the house, it was concluded that she, along with John Eccles, who was implicated in so many of her affairs, were the probable murderers. George Snodgrass, who was a long-standing friend of Mrs. Cunningham, and smitten with her daughter Helen, was believed to have assisted in some manner. The coroner, Connery, placed Emma Cunningham and her daughters under house arrest on suspicion of murder, and Eccles and Snodgrass were removed to the police station house on remand. Henry Clinton, acting for Mrs. Cunningham, put up a ferocious defence of his client. He challenged every point, cross-examined each witness, but in the rather loose conduct which Connery permitted in the proceedings, it was a hard slog. It was pointed out by the prosecutor that none of the revelations concerning the poor relations between Dr. Burdell and Mrs. Cunningham during the autumn of 1856 spoke in favour of a marriage having occurred between the two, and Eckel had plainly impersonated Burdell on the occasion of the wedding with a view to securing Mrs. Cunningham's rights in the event of Burdell's death. Further proof of this was evinced by the fact that Mrs. Cunningham commenced a suit for breach of promise, a lawsuit not uncommon in those days, against a man who had broken off an engagement with a woman, against Dr. Burdell in September of 1856, just a month before the marriage, on the basis that Dr. Burdell had sexually assaulted her. Then, just days before the wedding, she dropped the suit. Mrs. Cunningham's attorney on that occasion was called, who gave evidence that 3 weeks after October the 28th and the supposed wedding, she had again sought his advice in contemplation of a breach of promise suit. This would have meant she was contemplating a breach of promise suit against a man she had already married. It was further suggested that Mrs. Cunningham had initially sought to entrap Dr. Burdell into marriage, but failing in this regard, she had persuaded her lover, Eckel, to impersonate Burdell in a sham marriage, either with a view to claiming between $30,000 and $40,000 as his widow if he should die, or of expediting his death by killing Burdell. The eldest daughter, Augusta Cunningham, insisted the marriage had taken place, and that the married couple shared a bed until about a month before the murder. Her sister Helen, however, said she knew nothing of the marriage until the time of the death, and that she never knew her mother to sleep with Dr. Burdell. George Snodgrass, the 18-year-old in the house and on the 4th floor of the building, who was smitten with the younger Cunningham girl, Helen, it was suggested was an accessory in some manner too. He had rowed with the doctor recently over a locked front door which prevented the doctor from gaining access to the house late one night. Farrell, the man who had heard the cry of murder while sitting fixing his shoe on the doorstep at 10:45 p.m. on the 29th of January, and the other suggestive sounds following this, testified that the man who opened the door on that occasion was John Eckel. Thus John Eckel, if Farrell's testimony was to be believed, was there in the hallway at the time of the murder. Finally, a cutlery seller, Margaret Avicet, told the inquest she sold the dagger to Snodgrass a day or two prior to the murder. She produced an identical knife to that she had sold him, and examined by a doctor, it was declared to be capable of administering the wounds found on Dr. Burdell's body. The jury returned a verdict that Mrs. Cunningham and John Eckel were responsible for the murder of Dr. Burdell. Snodgrass was an accessory, and Augusta and Helen were guilty of concealing facts from the inquest. As a result of this, Emma Cunningham and John Eckel were indicted for murder, and she, Eckel, and Snodgrass were removed to custody, the latter two to the Tombs prison in New York, to await the matter coming before a grand jury. The trial of Emma Cunningham began on May the 6th, 1857. It lasted just 3 days and was something of an anticlimax after the drama of the 14-day inquest. Justice Davis oversaw the proceedings and was determined to run a tight ship after the liberal mayhem of the coroner's court. New York City District Attorney Abraham Oakey Hall appeared for the prosecution, and Henry Loren Clinton again appeared for the defense. It was decided to proceed first with the prosecution of Emma Cunningham. The evidence was strongest against her, and thus that of Eckel and Snodgrass were held in abeyance pending the outcome of the Cunningham trial. The trial was succinct. The evidence, such as it was heard. The prosecution did its best to prove that Cunningham had motive for murdering Burdell, had expressed violent intentions towards him, and murdered him as a means of obtaining his fortune from him, and of avoiding eviction from the property for herself and her family, if he signed the document the following day giving effect to this. But the evidence relating to the supposed marriage between Mrs. Cunningham and Dr. Burdell, an important proof of intention, was not heard in detail, as its validity was being considered separately by a surrogate's court to determine who should inherit Dr. Burdell's estate. That had the effect of weakening the case against Mrs. Cunningham. The defense also challenged the idea that the crime was committed by a left-handed person, or that Mrs. Cunningham was left-handed or strong enough in that hand to inflict the wounds. Mrs. Cunningham did not give evidence on her own behalf, and her counsel pointed to the wholly circumstantial nature of the evidence against her, which was, he said, insufficient to procure a verdict of guilty. The prosecution case was certainly suggestive, but was it enough? The judge was sceptical. The jury deliberated in the matter for about 90 minutes, and then returned a verdict of not guilty. Following this, the cases against John Eckel and George Snodgrass inevitably fell away. What do we know of the murder when the vast quantity of testimony, which was often a confused mass of irrelevant or superfluous anecdote, is examined? We know that Harvey Burdell entered the house at 10:45 on the evening of the 29th of January 1857. At that time there were several people in the house. On the fourth attic floor there was the cook and the two Cunningham boys. On the third floor there was Augusta and Helen. The whereabouts of Emma Cunningham, John Eckel and George Snodgrass are corroborated only by themselves. Harvey Burdell must have gone to his room, unlocked his door, and, before removing his key, entered, at which point he was assaulted and murdered. None of the members of the house, we are told, heard any aspect of this, although 4 people in the street or in neighbouring dwellings did. If we accept that no person from outside of the house could have murdered Dr. Burdell, and this possibility does seem a remote one, then we may be certain that one or more of the inmates of the house murdered him. That much is clear. But who was it? There are several options given the restricted number of people in the house. The 2 boys, who were the youngest children, can be discounted. So can the younger Cunningham daughter, Helen. Her testimony was often at odds with that of her sister. She seemed to be frightened and generally in ignorance. Her older sister, Augusta, however, was self-possessed, had her mother's hardness, and was repeatedly caught lying or making improbable assertions. She it was who attested to her mother's marriage. Augusta had certainly been identified as a witness to the marriage which took place on the 28th of October. It seems that on that evening she had visited a friend with her mother. The daughter of the friend said she was invited to play the piano, and when the man, whom she identified as being Eckel, arrived, Augusta took over from her and played and sang in a manner which made it impossible to hear the conversation taking place between Eckel and Emma. Augusta had been pushed roughly from Burdell's room when he was accusing her mother of theft. It was claimed that she had pulled out his hair. She was her mother's daughter. She was clearly fully aware of the situation in the house, was an accessory in the fraudulent marriage and in other arguments in the house, and it is reasonable to suppose she knew of the murder also. She can hardly have been in ignorance of it, so steeped was she in all the affairs leading up to it. Can we be certain the marriage was a fraud? Yes. Mrs. Cunningham was suing Burdell for breach of promise on the 18th of October. A week later she dropped the suit, and the marriage took place. It might be thought that Burdell had been prevailed upon to marry Mrs. Cunningham, perhaps unwillingly, and this was why she had dropped her breach of promise suit. Except this will not do, because by this time Burdell indisputably loathed Mrs. Cunningham, and was determined to have her removed by some means from his house. And because, just 3 weeks after the supposed wedding took place, Mrs. Cunningham again visited her attorney, with a view to reopening the breach of promise suit. In other words, she was proposing to sue her husband for breach of promise. This is plainly absurd. It is tantamount to an admission by her that they were not married. If any doubt should remain concerning this, it was also ascertained that Dr. Burdell had been staying in a hotel in Saratoga on the evening of the 28th of October. The wedding which occurred that evening was plainly between Mrs. Cunningham and someone else. Of course it must have been her lover, John Eckel. He was wearing a dark wig, and his whiskers were dyed. He was quite bald, it was said, and his remaining hair was sandy-coloured. He was impersonating Dr. Burdell. the Reverend Marvin noticed the strangeness of his whiskers and commented to his wife that they were false. The next day, Eckel examined the marriage certificate and declared it to be correct. The name Burdell had been spelt Burdell with an E rather than a U. Harvey Burdell would likely have noticed a misspelling of his own name. The false wedding is key here. It was to provide the means by which the clever and resourceful Mrs. Cunningham could take possession of Dr. Burdell's fortune by one means or another. It is probable she had entered into a relationship with Burdell with the intention of marrying a wealthy doctor. She was a well-to-do widow, but she had expenses, and she was not a frugal person. But Burdell was a step up. He owned substantial property and had made a sizable fortune as a dentist. He invited her into his house, leasing the property to her as landlady. Their relationship was intimate, but she was disappointed. Burdell was not a marrying man. He was a womanizer. He had at least one other mistress at this time. He pursued other women, and she became jealous. He was, moreover, mean, tight-fisted. He ate at cheap restaurants, slept on the sofa in his office. He walked rather than took a carriage because he regarded it as an extravagance. He quarrelled over money with anyone, watched every penny. Once he discovered that Mrs. Cunningham had lit 2 fires during a day, and was furious. It was an extravagant use of coal. He himself wore a shawl to keep warm. It was cheaper. It emerged in court that he had persuaded his brother, John, on his deathbed, to leave his fortune to him, so that he could take care of John's wife and sons. After John's death, however, the widow and sons received nothing from Harvey. He wasn't a nice man, but Emma Cunningham was more than his equal in this regard. She had been a prostitute in Brooklyn, according to some accounts in the newspapers, and was described somewhat euphemistically as being well known in Brooklyn. He was widely suspected amongst acquaintances and the police as being responsible for her first husband's death. He was older than her, had speculated his money away, had fallen on hard times, but he had a $10,000 insurance policy on his life. She quite probably decided to cash this in, but it will never be known beyond a well-founded suspicion. What is certain is that around this time she had become acquainted with Harvey Burdell. There are enough stories concerning Burdell's amatory adventures, accusations regarding his affairs with married women, even with his brother's wife, to give substance to the idea that he had seduced Emma Cunningham around the time of her husband's death, perhaps was aware of her part in her husband's death. If so, it would account for his real fear that she intended him harm, and his relating to others his anxiety that she might murder him. It was not merely paranoia. He either had suspicions that she had killed her husband previously, or else he knew it. That is why he would eat nothing or drink nothing she gave him. He sent her offerings back to her. He did not simply dispose of them without consuming them, which would have been an obvious and discreet way of dealing with this. He sent them back to her. He wanted her to know that he guessed her intention. He amplified this by telling his partner, Dr. Blaisdell, that he feared she was going to murder him. He said this in her presence. She was angry. Blaisdell, embarrassed, nonplussed, of course. It was an intimation to her that he was laying down corroboration to discourage any such act on her part. She clearly had some sort of intention, was in cahoots with John Eckel, when she contrived the fraudulent marriage with Burdell on the 28th of October, 1856. The marriage served no purpose whatsoever unless Burdell's death was consequent upon it. Then she would gain, at the very least, a dower of $30,000 to $40,000, over $1 million today. But it may well have been as a result of Burdell's increased caution, refusing foods and drinks she sent him, that frustrated this. She returned to her attorney, requesting that he again pursue Burdell for breach of promise. This was in late November, and by this time she had clearly discarded the notion of murder, quite probably because she faced insuperable difficulties with it. The doctor always ate out. refused her food and drink offerings. He locked his door. He mentioned the matter to people. He was on his guard. But relations between the two deteriorated further. The disregard each felt for the other intensified. He desperately wished to remove her from his house and life, and so did she, but only on her terms and to her financial advantage. Her detestation of Harvey Burdell was plain to all. By the time of the party on the 14th of January, Harvey Burdell had words with her. He was unsociable. He didn't like strangers in his house. There were a lot of people. He was his curmudgeonly self. He told people she was the most horrible woman he had ever met. He surely meant it. She went about sending poisoned pen letters to people and to his relatives, further estranging him from them. Or so his relations and others said. He told the cook, Hannah, he had learned things about her and seen things through the keyhole of her door that informed him she was not the person he thought she was. She spied through his keyhole too, and through his window, before telling Mr. Cyrenus Stevens that he had been engaged in sexual activities with his wife, Mrs. Stevens. This may or may not have been true. Harvey Burdell was certainly equal to such mischief, although Stevens appears to have believed Burdell's denial when he confronted him over the claim. But whether it was true or not, the association between Burdell and Mrs. Cunningham had reached its terminal point. Dr. Burdell now took the step which would bring the matter to a close. He sought to enforce an agreement to end her lease on the house, or bring it to its termination on its 12-month anniversary, the 1st of May. He was due to sign the document giving effect to this on the day after his murder. Did Mrs. Cunningham know of it? Of course she did. She had a key to his office and key to his safe. He accused her of stealing a note to the value of $600 from it. The cook, Hannah, said Mrs. Cunningham had a key, a false key she called it. She was in the habit of entering his room in his absence. If she spied on him through his window, through his keyhole, and was so intimately involved in obtaining knowledge which she could relay to others, either anonymously or personally, or through a proxy, then, in possession of a key, she would certainly seek to expand her knowledge of his affairs by every means. She was a wily, unscrupulous woman, and she would be enraged by the realization that he was about to remove her and her family from his house. She had been outwitted by Burdell. He was a skinflint, miserly, mean, petty, short-tempered, and he had seen through her machinations and manoeuvres and bypassed them. He was, in essence, about to evict her. Once the document was signed, it would be a fait accompli. There was no longer any time for a breach of promise suit on her part. The doctor was not shy of litigation in any case, and she would be out of his house before anything could be done about it. The matter was now an urgent one for Emma Cunningham. A clever woman, all who knew her said she did not like to be bested. She was a woman who got her way, and she would do anything to ensure this. She was a dangerous woman, and Harvey Burdell knew it. It is obvious that Mrs. Cunningham had brought John Eccles into her confidence. The relevant documents were found in his possession. He had impersonated a lawyer, Van Dolen, and the doctor himself to effect the bogus marriage. He was a furtive, untrustworthy man, whom the newspapers reported to be incapable of looking anyone in the eye. Emma had no difficulty in suborning John Eccles to her will. The two were in a sexual relationship. Burdell had implied as much to the cook, Hannah. The maid, Mary Donoghue, told the coroner's court that Eccles' bed never looked like it had been slept in. But Mrs. Cunningham's bed always had the appearance of two people having slept there. Exactly what occurred on the evening of the 29th of January 1857 at 31 Bond Street is beyond us, but it is not difficult to guess. The trap was sprung on the 29th of January. Emma asked Eccles to bring her some figs and oranges from the shops on his way home. He brought these. It was thought by police that these had been used to administer powerful sedative drugs to the two young boys, and possibly to the younger daughter, Helen, and the cook, Hannah. This seems to be quite probable, given that none of these people seem to have heard anything on the evening, in spite of the fact that 4 people outside the house did hear the murder, and distinctly. Mrs. Cunningham ensured the coast was cleared on that evening by sending the members of the household to bed early. It was odd, peremptory. It is interesting to note that she had done it a couple of times before in the previous few days. On the 24th of January, after the police intervention, and on the 25th, which suggests she had been intending to kill Burdell on those earlier occasions, but was thwarted for some reason. This time the stars came into alignment. Daniel Ullman was absent from the house. His return was not expected before the early hours. It was known that Burdell returned to the house between 10 and 11, so the servants and household were retired by order of Mrs. Cunningham before 10 p.m. She and Eckel then purported to retire also. But they crept downstairs to the floor below, to the doctor's room, and, using the false key, opened the door. Here they concealed themselves in the darkness, awaiting Burdell's return. Harvey Burdell was last seen walking along Bond Street at around 10:45 p.m. He could have no idea, for all his suspicions, that the 2 people he feared most in the world awaited him in his dark chambers. He was seen entering the street door, using his latchkey. He went up the stairs, entered his room, leaving the key in the door. At this point, the door was slammed shut by one of his assassins, who was concealed behind it. Eckel sprang and seized him, using a rope round his neck to stifle his cries. The marks of the ligature were found on his neck at autopsy. Eckel was said to be a broad, powerful man, as was Harvey Burdell, so it would naturally fall to Eckel to restrain him and ensure that no cries could be emitted which would alert the house, even in its drugged state, or any neighbours. It was mostly successful, but the quiet and empty street had 3 people nearby, and a neighbour just retiring to his bed in the house across the road. They heard the first syllable of "murd" before the second was choked off in a guttural "duh." Emma Cunningham then raised her knife and stabbed Harvey Burdell repeatedly. Why was it Emma? Because it was personal, vindictive. Harvey Burdell was stabbed with all the viciousness that personal animosity affords. It was said that any one of the main wounds would be sufficient to kill Burdell. It went beyond necessity. It was the cold fury of revenge upon a man whom she had been heard to say had no right to live, and on another occasion that she would have his heart's blood. Hell had no fury, as Emma Cunningham had that night. It may well be that Snodgrass assisted in the murder, beyond the general belief that he had assisted in the cleaning up. Burdell was a large man. Even with the element of surprise, restraining him would not be easy for one man. He would be a man fighting for his life, and Snodgrass had been with Eckel and Cunningham on the evening of the 24th of January, when the latter ordered the household to retire early to their rooms. It is clear that something was to be attempted then. Snodgrass's shirt was found with blood on it in the attic room. Harvey Burdell's assassins were covered in blood at the end of this fatal assault. Eckel, if Farrell is to be believed, went to the house door. It was probably with a view to checking no one in the street had heard the cry of "murder" and raised the alarm. He was in his shirt sleeves, and so was hardly planning on going anywhere, and he told Farrell to go away. He left traces of blood on the wall in the hallway to the door in doing so. Emma and Eckel removed their blood-soiled clothes and burnt them in the attic grate. But Snodgrass did not burn his shirt. It was found. Why? There was a good reason for this. It turned out that it was not his. He had borrowed it from a friend, and probably thought he could wash it, but forgot. The distinctive smell of burning cloth attracted the attention of several neighbours as they passed along the street to their houses. John Eckel, Emma Cunningham, and George Snodgrass then retired separately to their rooms and awaited the morning. When Daniel Ullman returned to the house at around 12:30 a.m., it was silent. He noticed nothing amiss. Eckel was up uncharacteristically early at 7. He later said he was required on business an hour earlier than usual, but no proof of this was given. The man whom he met denied there was any urgency about their business at all. Eckel needed to get out of the house to dispose of the knife, of any other incriminating items remaining. He disposed of anything he needed to conceal on his journey to his place of business. The others in the house rose and breakfasted. Emma Cunningham saw the errand boy about his business, awaited the discovery of Harvey's body by him. But the boy did not notice. He left coal in a scuttle at his master's door. He replenished all the coal scuttles. Emma was in a sombre mood. The boy noticed it. She was on edge. She was waiting the moment. It was the moment of her entrance. And she was a fine actress of a dramatic sort. Breakfast passed uneventfully. Still the body had not been discovered. At last there was the sound of a door slamming, footsteps below, the cry of the cook, Hannah. Then a thumping on the stairs as she came up to Mrs. Cunningham's room to tell her what she already knew. Harvey was dead. Mrs. Cunningham threw herself about, sobbed, made no inquiry. There was no disbelief. She did not seek confirmation. What? Who? How? In due course, the doctors, the coroner, the authorities were brought in. There seems little doubt that Eckel and Emma Cunningham, and probably George Snodgrass, got away with the murder of Dr. Burdell in January 1857. It is likely, too, that Augusta was, at the very least, an accessory in the matter. She may even have been involved in the murder itself. She was steeped so thoroughly in every other aspect of the affair before and after the murder, in the fraudulent marriage, the various altercations in the house, the subterfuges, so it is entirely possible. Following her release from prison after her acquittal, Mrs. Cunningham pressed on with her claims to Harvey Burdell's will, insisting she was his widow. But on the 26th of August, the surrogate court declared that there was no possible doubt in the matter. Emma Cunningham had not been married to Harvey Burdell. Dr. Burdell was proved, said the judge, to be elsewhere at the time of the supposed marriage. Not content with narrowly escaping the gallows, the astonishing nerve of Emma Cunningham held. She did not like to be bested. She had a new idea. She persuaded a Dr. Ahl to supply her with a baby from the hospital. But Ahl reported the matter to the authorities. They played a careful hand on receipt of this information from him. Mrs. Cunningham, disguised as a sister of charity, went to collect an infant from the hospital, which was handed to her by Dr. Ahl. She returned to 31 Bond Street, and on the following day announced to the world she had given birth to Dr. Burdell's child. It was a moment of triumph and joy for her, but it didn't last. A policeman arrived soon afterwards, and she was arrested and spent a short time in prison for this attempted fraud. The child was returned to its rightful mother, and the pair became, briefly, celebrities. Emma Cunningham's appeal against the decision to exclude her from Harvey Burdell's estate was finally denied in May 1859. She married again in August 1860 to a Reverend Sheehan in California. The Chicago Tribune reported in July 1861 that following an altercation between the married couple, Mrs. Sheehan had fallen from a boat into the river. Perhaps the Reverend Sheehan pushed her. On the 18th of January 1874, Emma would now have been 55 years old. It was reported that Mrs. Emma Cunningham, of Burdell murder notoriety, was heard to be a resident of Omaha, and with a wry expression, the reporter said, the impression had prevailed that she had departed to a warmer place. Indeed. George Snodgrass changed his name to George Reed, worked as a cobbler for a time, but the murder cast a long shadow over him too, and he had to move regularly from place to place. John Eckel died in the New York State Penitentiary, where he was incarcerated for forgery in December 1869. It is not clear what became of Reverend Sheehan, but Emma Cunningham married again. A William Williams was the happy groom. The New York Times reported on the 25th of November 1884 that she appeared briefly in court, still with piercing black eyes, seeking a summons. Her appearance was described as being shabby. She lived with her niece during her final years at 321 East 119th Street, and it was here she died on Tuesday, the 13th of September, 1887. She was 69 years old.